Head of campaigns for Popular Conservatism, Andrew Allison. Andrew, good afternoon. How are you?
Well, Jeremy, that's an introduction, isn't it?
Well, you know, I've been on holiday, me old son. One of the great stories of today, because everybody says, you always favoured Trump. No, I don't. There's plenty about the orange man, baby, I don't. But Donald Trump and the White House has attacked the BBC's coverage of the Gaza conflict, accusing the broadcaster of taking Hamas's word as total truth. Donald Trump's press secretary accused the BBC of having to repeatedly correct its reporting from the territory about aid distribution. Her comments came after repeated incidents involving the death of dozens of Palestinians around aid distribution centres controlled by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, a new US and Israeli-backed organisation with Israeli troops accused of firing at civilians. A BBC spokesman said the claim the BBC took down a story after reviewing footage is completely wrong. We did not remove any story and we stand by our journalism. As a man for Popular Conservatism, what do you think of the BBC's coverage of stories? I mean, if we could just add in, yesterday it came out they want even more of the licence fee, Andrew Allison.
Yes, they do indeed. And as someone who also in a previous life ran a campaign for the abolition of the licence fee, you can probably guess where I stand on all of this. But in all fairness, it's not just the BBC. There are multiple media outlets all across the world who seem to forget that the Gazan Health Ministry is a propaganda arm of Hamas. So if Hamas tells you that Israel's killed half a dozen people, the chances are they haven't killed anyone. So why should we believe a word that Hamas says? But of course, the BBC wants to believe that there's a humanitarian crisis going on in Gaza. It wants to believe the worst of Israel because that's its worldview. And this is how far that the BBC has sunk, that it's getting criticised by the press secretary at the White House.
I believe there is a humanitarian crisis. I don't like what I see. I don't see it from one side. I see it from all sides. But I'm absolutely with you that the BBC, and I had this discussion yesterday with the amazing Adrian Mills, who used to do That's Life, of course, one of the best shows that was ever on television, and he defended the BBC, but he also criticised it. But my point about the BBC is I don't believe they're fit for purpose in 2025. I think that you would know this when you work in commercial radio or television or whatever, or whether you work online, it's all about how many hits and how many views, and that creates revenue via sponsorship or via advertising. And for the BBC to be the state broadcaster and to not have to prove itself, I think, is bad enough in a professional sense. But there is no doubt that if you look at the cut of their jib, as my old man would have said, God rest his soul, it is to the left. And I'm not just saying that because we're to the right, to a degree, I suppose. I'm just being honest. I mean, the state broadcasters should be straight down the middle. And they're not. They're worthy and they're woke. And it's blatantly obvious to anybody, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And can I just clarify what I said? Yes, there is huge humanitarian problems going on in Gaza. It's just that I wouldn't believe everything that comes out of the mouths of Hamas.
No.
But yes, the worldview of the BBC is to the left, and it's just as simple as that. But it's this metropolitan left worldview, isn't it? It's what you get out of Keir Starmer and Lord Hermer. It's not a working class left point of view, which is why Labour is doing quite badly in its traditional working class areas to other parties.
It'd be very interesting if the BBC, it would be very interesting, wouldn't it, if the BBC had to go to a subscription-based service. It would be really interesting to see all those people. By the way, I think Karen Levitt's fantastic. I'm just going to put it out there, the press secretary for Donald Trump.
Yes.
I think she does not give a rat's backside, and I love that about her. I think it would be interesting if the BBC went to a subscription service and had to say, you know, how would they prove themselves? Do you think they would be popular? Do you think people would I don't think people at the price would do it at all. Not in a million years.
Well, the BBC, as you know, Jeremy, says things like, oh, we're just 35 pence a day, 40 pence a day, whatever it is. It's an enormous value. Well, my reply is always the same. If it's such enormous value, then you have nothing to fear going to a subscription service. Surely you will get millions, tens of millions of people all wanting to subscribe to you. The problem for the BBC is that he knows it's not particularly trusted anymore, and he knows that its output is certainly not what it was like when I was growing up in the 1970s and 80s, when it was absolutely brilliant programming. But above all, the BBC was trusted. That has gone now completely. So the reason why the BBC won't voluntarily moved to a subscription service is because of that. But of course, it's now pleading that it's skint, that it needs more of our money, even though the very audiences, the older people who tend to watch the BBC,
when they say they're skint, I don't know the exact amount, but didn't they get over 3 billion quid last year or something more? Didn't they?
Yeah, but you can't get much with 3 billion quid these days, according to Tony Hall. You know, sarcastically, I said
£3 billion.
They get an absolute fortune, but they're always complaining that they haven't got enough money. I mean, maybe this year they'll have to send fewer journalists to a climate change conference or something
200.
like that.
Or what did I hear? 200 to Glastonbury or something, isn't it?
Well, they've sent massive amounts of journalists to things like Glastonbury, but they also have to these various UN summits on climate change and things like that. But that's what the BBC is complaining about, and I think it will come a time when we will get some form of subscription service for the BBC, because the BBC is sort of clinging on to an analog funding system in a digital world. And when you look at the viewing figures, not just for the BBC but for terrestrial television in general, I mean, it's pathetic. I did some research earlier. The highest viewing figures ever for EastEnders was a Christmas Day episode in 1986, over 30 million people.
I tell you, do you know how sad I am? 29,703,000. Absolutely. The divorce letter from Ange, Dirty
yes,
Den
that's
to
the
Ange.
one. Yes, yeah. That's right. But now, I mean, EastEnders struggles to get 4 million. I mean, really
you think? I mean, here's a test for you. Biggest daytime morning audience ever in the history of British television? Figure?
I don't know.
2 million? 4 million people watching, 2 million, right? Nowadays, what does daytime television get now? 500, 600,000? Shan't tell you who got 2 million, because I'll be fired, but it's the truth.
No, well, yeah, but that's true. But the thing is, we just watch TV completely differently now.
Absolutely. On your smartphone, people think of course, the kids. I mean, they're joking about my daughter and LinkedIn. You watch it, terrestrial television, right, is never going to be what it was. And the BBC, I think the real gripe with the BBC, Andrew, is that they're this sort of, they carry on the same, and they make their demands and they expect to be given this money, and they don't seem to have modernised, and they don't seem to have improved what they give and the output that they give. And I think that's the frustration for so many people. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, my son, my youngest son's 8 years old, and he never watches live television. No. I mean, just never.
No, I agree. Just very quickly, as the head of campaigns at Popular Conservatism, one of the things that Conservatives were always strong about until Theresa May destroyed it was policing. But the Tories, let's be perfectly honest, justifiably, you could say, and quite rightly, that one of the biggest, I think, worst things that they did was to start to cut police numbers to the point where it's ludicrous. Police chiefs today warning Starmer that they will have to make stark choices. If the Treasury cuts more from them, they might not be able to solve certain crimes. Call me old-fashioned and a bit cynical, but strikes me that the British police don't actually solve many crimes anymore anyway, unless you write an offensive tweet. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I think you're right. And there's two stories in one here. I completely agree that it was a really bad error of judgment on behalf of Theresa May to cut
dreadful
numbers. And I said that at the time, and I know some Conservative MPs who voted against it. People like, I think, Philip Davies, don't you? He was a former Conservative MP. Philip, absolutely. And Philip spoke strongly against it. But there's also those at the top of some police forces are quite happy to go around arresting people and seeking prosecutions because they've written something on Twitter or.
But that's just ego. That's not crime on the streets.
But that is their choice. They are choosing to do that. Now, I have no doubt that the police resources are stretched, but then they're going to make the right choices. And the people, the choices that the British public wants them to make is to go after people who are proper villains, people who are nicking things, people who are rapists, who are paedophiles, people doing all those sorts of real crimes that you want off the street. They don't want them focusing on people who've written something on Twitter which they later regret.
And that's my point about the whole country we now live in and the world we seem to frequent, is that Be it the police, be it politicians, they don't seem to understand what the British people are saying. They want safe streets. They want crimes investigated. They just want fairness. They want to be able to see a doctor or a dentist. The reason they object to illegal migration is because, as I keep saying, they're at the back of the queue and they're paying the stamp. We've had stories today. It's not rocket science. It's not difficult for a politician to go, do you know what? I'm going to bat for the British people. That's not racist. It's not wrong. A bat for anybody. But first and foremost, I've 70 million people in this country. You just heard it from that guy from Bournemouth. And he said, I worked all my life. I've had some issues. And I was in a really bad place. I was homeless. First time in my life, asked for something. Not interested.
Yeah,
I might as well have come in on a boat. It's not inaccurate to say it.
Exactly. And you remember that David Cameron said we're going to bring net migration down to the tens of thousands, which of course never happened. And it was failed promise after failed promise, which partly resulted in the demise of my party at the general election last year, and in many ways rightly so. I mean, promises were made and promises were not delivered.
We're always delighted to have you on this station, mate. It's a real pleasure. We love having you on. Andrew Allison, thank you, my friend, head of campaigns at Popular Conservatism.